In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the current and future prospects of African botanical medicine. And yes, we're definitely going to touch on cannabis, but we're going to speak more broadly about the sector. And in addition, we're going to also cover topics related to forgotten and neglected foods. Now, to help me cover this topic, I've got Professor David Katerere on, who's the current research platform chair for the advancement in pharmaceutical and biotech in Africa at the Tshwane University of Technology. He's going to unpack for us the sector with his passion coinciding from botanical medicines through to his interest in cannabis and ultimately the scope and potential of medicines coming from the continent. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Hi, Prof. It's great to have you on today. It's been an absolute pleasure dealing with you. I know you've been active on YouTube as well, disseminating information for the broader audience and public. So what I want to get into today is I know you have this absolute passion for traditional African medicines, and you have a background as in pharmacology. Can you give us a bit more context on your roots in the development from pharmacology, your interest in African botanicals, and how this all aroused?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Jeff, for inviting me, and I am a great admirer of your work. Yeah. So actually, my background is in pharmacy. Quite a sickly child growing up, and so I was exposed to medicines, both conventional medicines and also traditional medicines. And the interesting thing is, my grandmothers on both my paternal and maternal side were actually traditional healers. So my maternal grandmother was a traditional birth attendant, so these are things that I kind of grew up around. And then going into university, I discovered, wow, these pharmaceuticals actually come from plants. So that was really a great moment for me, an eye-opening moment. And then so I was in university, I took up a job part-time, working on some herbs, and that ended up being a life's passion. I was then exposed to Professor Hostetman, who was then at a Swiss university. And when he saw my thesis at that stage, he was very, very interested and very encouraging. And thereafter, I went to Strathclyde University, which has a great history of researching phytochemistry and medicinal chemistry. And so I was exposed to people from all over the world, from Malaysia, Thailand, all these places. And I had very good supervisors. And so I worked then on the Combretaceae family, which is a family of over 400 species and is predominantly African. And at that stage, my interest was cancer because Combretaceae, actually the South African Combretaceae, which is called Combretum zuluensis, had become of great interest to the National Cancer Institute, and it isolated for the first time an angiogenic compound, or an anti-angiogenesis compound, actually, and they patented it through University of Arizona. I isolated about 30 compounds out of that. Yeah.
No, awesome,
So
excellent.
that's
And that's your background. And then obviously you've been quite involved with pharmacology students, training, getting the next generation of pharmacists ready to get
yeah.
involved. And it's great because I think they need to have that appreciation for botanicals as well, because I think it's such an important context, for pharmacists. So very often it's clinical aspects that they consider. I wanted to jump to the Association of African Medicinal Plants Standards. I know you're
Yes.
active with that. You've been quite progressive in pushing that forward. What has driven you to that point? In terms of driving the on the front of the association.
Okay, so the association was actually founded in 2010, and then they launched their African herbal pharmacopoeia back then. So about a few years ago, I was asked to come on board as one of the co-editors. And so my philosophy is that we need to build an industry. And for us to build an industry, we then need to look at the value chain. We need to look at what people are doing. But most of all, we also need to look at quality standards. How do we actually make products that are, uh, um, uniform in a sense? There's very little batch to batch variation. Products that are also making rational claims, and therefore for us to do that, when you look at the history of medicine, it tells you that you get to a point where you need to make a recipe, so a pharmacopoeia is really a recipe, so that whoever is making that product is making it the same way that anybody else is making it. And we had not really had a recipe for African, herbal products. So the African herbal pharmacopoeia was really like the first really big effort at pushing the standardization of African botanicals.
Yeah.
And now we are working on the second version of it, which should be available next year. But as part of then creating awareness around that, we're then having all these activities. We've got a newsletter, and we curate some of the content on the Pharma Connect channel, the Connect conversation channel, as you know. And all of that is really, number one, advocacy, so that people know what we're doing, but also creating awareness around these things, whether it's policy with policymakers, with entrepreneurs, and then of course training, because without training, again, you cannot build an industry.
Yeah, fully. And I mean, that's a great initiative. I mean, it's absolutely necessary that there's almost a structured approach to the commercialization of African botanical medicine. And I want to maybe stick on this point because you've had a lot of experience in the space. And in terms of maybe it's a two-pronged type of question, but what has South Africa done well in terms of commercialization around African botanicals? And then what are some of the challenges that have been very clear from maybe the onset and still persist as challenges that should be addressed to really enable? I mean, awareness is one thing, and it's a fantastic initiative you've taken with the YouTube channel, and we'll get to that in a second because I want to highlight it. But besides awareness of African botanicals, where have we gotten it right as Sub-Saharan Africa, and where could we focus our energies and efforts, and where can maybe government support the initiatives around indigenous knowledge systems and African botanicals?
Yeah. Quite a complicated question. So maybe let me start about what we've done well. So if you go into any supermarket or pharmacy, you're going to get, African herbals. They're there. We can't ignore them. And they have a huge market. I mean, you can talk about rooibos, for instance.
Yeah.
But as you know, aloe ferox, aloe bitters is probably has the longest history of commercialization, the Cape aloes. They're even in the British Pharmacopoeia, for instance. Yeah. So we've got that. We've got the resources in terms of, we are blessed with the plants, and to some extent even the animals, which are unique. I think we've done quite well from an entrepreneurship perspective. There are people pushing the envelope and trying to put these products on the market, however crude the products are. But that's important, right? Because there are no perfect conditions. That's what I always say. But now what we need to do is we need to look at how we can add value to these products. How is it that we can actually bring science into the formulation of these products? And when I say science, I'm really talking mostly around quality issues.
Yeah.
So, for instance, are we thinking about pesticides, and excluding pesticides? Are we thinking about excluding heavy metals? Are we thinking about how we actually harvest these products so that from a phytosanitary perspective, they are good and they're clean? If we do that, then we can export. Because at the moment, we sit with a lot of these products, but then we don't have an export market because we really don't have quality and quality standards that we are putting into the product. So to the second part of your question, what do governments need to do? Certainly, like last month, we went on what I call the Great Cannabis Escapade, where we went around, Cape Town, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, even Malawi. And one of the biggest sort of gaps is the fact that we do not have testing facilities or testing labs, right? So the same with cannabis, the same with all the other herbal products. We sit with really good, if you like, biomass, but we actually don't know what's in there. We don't know the quality of the products. Therefore, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to export to other markets. So what policymakers ought to be doing is looking at how is it that we can take the pain from entrepreneurs, in terms of maybe subsidizing or setting up testing facilities in each of these countries, and also allowing for regional trade, because one of the issues that came up was it's even difficult for you to send your product to a South African lab. But the South African labs themselves are quite stretched. I know of labs which, when you send a product over to them, they would then send it out to their parent company in Europe or wherever. Yeah. So we really need to invest in that and create incentives around that. But then it also creates high-tech jobs, right? The analytical space is you're playing with really fancy toys, and you're giving people a lot of technology training.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, that route to commercialization is based on consumer standards, patient standards, and this also ties back to what you've been doing with the Association on African Medicinal Standards. So, it's one where it kind of interlays very well. And I think you've identified that for quite some time now, going back to 2010, the need for standardization around botanicals, because it's only once you know what's in the product and you can exclude certain things from the product in terms of contaminants, heavy metals, pesticides, that you're able to really commercialize, and that entrepreneurs can truly scale their businesses from just, and also it protects the consumer. And I think protecting consumers also an initiative that the state has, which is like facilitate entrepreneurs, make, like I said, remove the pain points, make it easier to commercialize, drive products forward. And that leads to things like formulation improvements. And then you start to hire formulation chemists, and the company expands, the product range diversifies, and then a brand is built around it. And I think that speaks very well to that. And I have to ask the question, because you mentioned your tour around to the different countries and the different regions for cannabis. Obviously, as an academic, it's always one where, we've always overcome stigma around cannabis. Everyone's had preconceived notions. What drew you into the field? I mean, you had obviously you had the botanical background, so there was this naturalness to you kind of already knew, like, well, it's cannabis, it's a plant. What's the risk? Maybe speak to me about that stigma, because it's always interesting, because there's certain academics that are still very cautious of being involved, and I mean, there's skill sets to be added to the industry. What drew you in maybe of cannabis besides the obvious?
Well, it's interesting because I actually don't quite know, because I have never smoked. I don't smoke. I've never smoked cannabis, so I know nothing of its effects, personally. But I think it was in 2018. I went to Italy, so I have a good collaborator there, Professor Katerere at University of Naples. And while I was there was actually a meeting of one of the Italian associations, and he invited me over. So everything was in Italian, of course, but I could follow because of, it was projected slides and things like that. And one of the things at that stage was that in Italy, cannabis could only be grown by the military.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's changed now. But then Professor Katerere was also the lab where all the products would come for testing, because it's patient specific. So, I mean, now people talk about personalized medicine, and they think it's high tech. I mean, cannabis is a very good one, because every patient needs a certain percentage of this, a certain percentage of that. Yeah, so Prof. Katerere was doing this. And then I invited him back to South Africa, and I said, come to South Africa for a lecture series, and I would really like you to focus on cannabis. And so he came over, we were here in Pretoria at Tshwane University of Technology. We went down to Free State, University of Free State, and then down to CPUT. And all throughout that, he was really talking about cannabis, the kind of clinical trials that have been done around it, the quality issues, and, the CBD, THC stories, and all of those things that, so it was a big lesson for me. And that's where I started looking at it as, actually, cannabis is a medicine, first of all. Yeah. And when we talk, so my involvement in cannabis is really around increasing access to medicines. My interest is not so much on the recreational side, but it's about how do we increase access to this medicine for African patients. And I think one of the sad things is that what we found on our tour is that a lot of the policies are outward looking. So it's about grow the cannabis, send it out almost in raw form. It's like how we mine our gold and we send it out to China. So grow the cannabis, send it out to certain markets. Those markets will add value to it, and then we buy it back at great expense, right? Whereas what we're saying is, let's have both markets, because African patients also deserve to have cannabis-based medicines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see it because, I mean, you've been an advocate for some time on the, improving local manufacturing of medicines, standards, how to capacitate the industry. And I also have a similar sense of it in terms of, like, I've seen with biologicals, how long that route to market is. And this is actually a very, it's not easy, but it's one where it's far more practical to bring traditional medicines, or let's just call it botanicals, to market than maybe something like a biological or vaccine that requires a lot of additional stability work. It requires, full dossier registrations. Not to say you can't do that for the botanical space, but there's still that route that's a little easier through unregistered medicine access through Section 21, where that would be almost impossible for biological, as a product to be developed in a short time frame. So I think there's a lot of wins and there's a lot of synergy there. Tell me a bit about the collaboration, because I know you've been participating with the CSIR, and there's this potential hub that's going to be set up for testing and extraction services. I know that it was a great presentation day you had at the CSIR. It was awesome to attend it. Tell me a bit about your activities in that space with the CSIR and the collaboration, and what you're hoping to see more of in terms of ease of access for maybe entrepreneurs going forward.
Yeah. So again, Jeff, it's another value chain approach, So when we look at the cannabis value chain, what you find is a lot of people want to be growers. So I've had lots of people pick up the phone, phone me and say, hey, how can I get a growing license? I've got a piece of land, so I want to get in there. And yet what it shows in data, if you look at the American data and data elsewhere, it shows us that actually the value is not in the growing. The value is in the extraction, in formulation, in distribution, and then in the dispensing side. Not just that, but more critically for a country like South Africa, where are the jobs in this value chain? Again, when you look at the data around the world, it's something like for every one job that you create in agriculture, you create 4 or 5 jobs upstream, right? So in terms of extraction, again, all the way up to sales and distribution.
Yeah.
However, the pain in that value chain is also on the extraction part, right? Pain because it's expensive to get equipment. It's fairly high-tech equipment, and you can't do it under a tree, as it were. You need infrastructure that's also quite costly, expensive. You need technicians, and HR, which is well versed with chemistry. So we looked at this and we thought, okay, if we are to unlock the value within South Africa and even in the region, one of the things that we ought to do is to invest in a toll manufacturing facility, right? Which is what the TUT CSIR Cannabis Research Center is going to be. So at that place, we're going to have all the high-tech stuff, so we've now imported a carbon dioxide extraction machine. We've got some ethanol equipment there as well, ethanol extracting equipment. And then, of course, we'll be able to do a lot of other things around that whole processing. And in that case, then an entrepreneur can walk in, pay a small fee, and have the extract made, and they can walk out with an extract. So we're trying to reduce the barriers to entry into this very sophisticated environment.
Yeah, no, fully. And I mean, this is the type of initiatives that really are important. And I think the CSIR is a recognized institution. Your work from TUT side as well. I mean, we need to be able to open up. It's very difficult to commercialize successfully when everything is strictly GMP, extremely highly regulated and export facing only. So, that's one. Those are the barriers we want to bring down. But I want to maybe switch ticker as well, because you've got this YouTube channel, and I'll link it in the description as well, around Connect Conversations Africa. What I'll say as well, you've covered great. I mean, you've talked about dossier setups. You've talked about botanicals for sure, a lot on botanicals. There's been on pollutants in the pharmaceutical industry, the different pharmaceutical sectors around Africa. So I've just completely enjoyed the content, and I love the fact that you don't often see. Usually, when I speak to professors, it's one of like, okay, it has to be a publication, it has to be peer reviewed, and that's how we disseminate our information. And it's fantastic to see the drive to get the content, because it's great content, onto YouTube, because it's readily available and really accessible. What inspired you to make that transition? Was it, normally it's someone young in the family who's big on YouTube, and you're like, oh, I can do this, I can put out the content. I just want to get a bit on the inspiration there.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? So remember we had that harsh lockdown back in March.
Yes, 2020.
Yeah, and it was supposed to be 2 weeks, and then it started just going on. So I was at home, and I'm the kind of guy who's used to doing things, you know, and I just thought I was gonna go mad, sitting there just waiting for the world to end. So then I thought, okay, let me communicate with the world, because I also, I like to write. In my other life, I was a Toastmaster.
Ah, yes,
competitive, quite competitive Toastmaster. So then I also realized that there was a gap in knowledge, or lack of knowledge around COVID, even at that stage. That's why you see that the channel still has like a COVID Connect kind of thing, because that's how it started. So my son and I started making these little videos trying to explain to children what COVID was. So you see one of the very early videos is about, okay, what do you understand by COVID? What do you understand by vaccine? And then I decided that we could also reach out to people at that stage who were really scared, who didn't know what was going on, and just start to talk to them. So some of our early episodes were around grief in a time of COVID, when a loved one would die and you couldn't go out and bury them, they just got buried. We also talked to COVID survivors at that stage. So those very early videos. So we started in about May of 2020, and those early videos were very focused on COVID. Then of course, as things started opening up, we started thinking, okay, what professional contribution can one be making to this profession? And I'm not, I'm a communicator. I just think that science should be communicated, because at the end of the day, Jeff, you're a taxpayer. You're paying for the work that I do, right? And you deserve to know what I do. And it's not an either or. So for instance, one of the interesting things was I had a student working on substandard and falsified medicines, what are generally called fake medicines, right? And you get them across the range. You get pharmaceuticals, you get vaccines, you get cannabis products, you get herbal products, you even get food. So this student actually had a thesis and submitted a thesis. It was a really good thesis. But in that thesis, we were also making very specific recommendations to the regulator around the fact that, for instance, in South Africa and across Africa, our laws do not have counterfeit medicines as a penal code.
Ah, got you.
Right? They don't even use. So we don't have what's called pharmaceutical crimes. Right? If you're caught with a fake cannabis, for instance, it's not a pharmaceutical crime. It's a crime of another sort. As it were. So that then it means that the law is fragmented. So out of that, we then had a webinar series where we brought people from across the world to talk about substandard and counterfeits. We then had a policy brief that we put out. And in fact, this started a conversation within the regulators. I mean, I've heard from two regulators, SAPRA and Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe about how they've actually started talking about substandard and counterfeit medicines. And then then we had all these TV interviews. So the student became a bit of a celebrity, and that was great, right? So yeah.
No, that's awesome. I mean, this is exactly it, and I love the fact that you post regularly. It's good dissemination of information for any. I mean, I can only think if you're a pharmacist or looking to get into the space, it's such a useful resource because it's actually quite difficult to certainly interpret everything out there because it's just not as available in Africa as what you would typically see in maybe other, like in the Northern Hemisphere. You tend to find a lot of this information in these discussion points on YouTube or on Vimeo or somewhere. But yeah, it's great to see it being disseminated. And I think everyone's pushing for better transparency about the sector. And I think that helps everyone to understand the sector better because it allows you to research, the space. And it's a great channel. So I'll include the link attached below.
Thank you very much.
No, absolutely.
Health literacy. So health literacy is also a very important thing. It was interesting because in one of the interviews that I was invited to, the first thing they asked was, so these fake medicines, are you talking about generic medicines? I was like, whoa.
Not the
same. Yeah. So then for me, it was a teaching moment, where you're then able to explain to members of the public that, look, these things are different. Generic medicines are authentic medicines and they're not fake. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's come off patent, and it's like you said, it's about education because that is often people have these preconceived notions about generics, and we'll talk about that some other day. I wanted to ask you a bit about you've got an initiative, obviously, with NutriGrow and forgotten and let's just call it neglected foods. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Okay, so again, about 2 years ago, we got a challenge, right, from a funder to say that they wanted to put out a technology or a product which utilized indigenous knowledge, and was useful. So because I work in the area of nutraceuticals, so these are products that have nutrition but also have functional, if you like, medical properties, or So then we thought, okay, and also taking into account climate change. So maize is a product that is a crop that came to Africa probably about 120 years ago. Doesn't adapt too well to climate change. It needs lots of rain, and yet we had indigenous crops, mainly the millets and sorghum. So we looked at this and we thought, okay, that's an interesting challenge. We can actually make a product out of this, but how do we add innovation to it? So we have a beverage, but then it also has probiotics in it. So now you suddenly have these benefits of having a high protein, gluten-free product, which is also lactose free because it's a so we call it a non-dairy yogurt.
Okay,
non-dairy drinking yogurt.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting because it's pushed me from being an academic into being an entrepreneur. So I need to now understand finance. How do you get into the marketplace? And like we were saying earlier on, what saved us was the fact that we could contract manufacture. So if we had to set up our whole own manufacturing facility, this business would not have taken off. So in fact, it's a lesson that I learned there, which we are now applying with the Cannabis Research Center to say, let's create a contract facility for other people trying to get in. So the product is there on the market. It's mostly here in Pretoria, but then we got exciting news because it's now going to be manufactured in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
So the Scottish guy said, okay, this is an interesting product. They will obviously have toffee in it. The toffs, they like their toffee flavors. and I think we are talking about coffee flavor and, other things that are local, tribal there. And then our colleague Robert says, oh, but people are asking if we can ferment the stuff into alcohol. And I said, well, that's interesting because this is Africa's whiskey, because for the longest time people have fermented sorghum
Yeah.
into alcohol. Yeah, so it's actually a very interesting journey, that one.
No, you can always leave
Yeah,
the Scottish to ferment something, you know.
yeah, that's it.
And between
Yeah,
the golf course and
yeah,
the whiskies.
yeah, that's
So
it. Yeah, so I have a Scottish brother-in-law in Zimbabwe who is fermenting any and everything, all sorts of fruits, and he's setting up a little winery. It's called Fruit Wines, Nyanga Fruit Wines, where he's
okay,
fermenting
awesome.
fruit. Yeah. And I tease him to say, oh yeah, that Scottish blood of yours just can't leave you alone.
Can't resist the temptation.
Yeah,
No, but I think
yeah,
functional foods is becoming very interesting. I mean, we've seen a lot of focus on plant-derived foods. Also, the
yeah.
meat industry, doing, synthesis of meat. It's an interesting space. There's a lot happening there. There's a lot of innovation. But I also wanted to just touch on, as a last maybe question, around, I know you've been a big advocate about the medicinal manufacturing capacity of South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this maybe relates a bit to, how does Africa approach it, and should they even approach it, in terms of, we saw what happened with India and China and their ability to build up massive infrastructure around mostly APIs, but also finished goods. Should Africa be trying to do the same thing? There's always that debate. It's sometimes better for the healthcare to just import a product and then you've got access, but there's risk, and we've seen the risk with COVID in terms of everything being reliant on the northern hemisphere for manufacturing, at least for APIs for vaccines in this instance. So, where's your view on I think healthcare will get a much stronger focus from multiple areas within government and sectors, private equity as well. How do you see the African pharmaceutical story if we talk about the next 5 years or 10 years? It's a bit of a complex question, but
Yeah,
how kind
but
of
it's
would
an
you hope to
interesting,
see it?
yeah,
Yeah, how would
yeah,
you, to just close us
yeah,
off? How do you hope to
yeah,
see the space
yeah.
develop? Yeah.
It's an interesting question. So I'm a research platform chair here at TUT for a chair that is called Pharmaceutical and Biotech Advancement in Africa. And I say to people, yeah, we are really, really ambitious, because we are not talking about advancement in South Africa. We're saying Africa, and I think it can be done. It just depends on how we do it. So there's a lot of money and interest right now around, APIs, like you're mentioning, the fact that I think globally people are thinking of hedging their bets, right? If you look at what's happening in Russia, even China, and saying, how can we have centers around the world that will, you can easily get product, not so logistically difficult. So I've given this a lot of thought in the recent past, because I've been working on some advisory notes. I think one of the things that we need to do is maybe look at how India did it. We probably need to create partnerships. So if it's APIs, let's get API manufacturers on the continent. Let's give them whatever incentives they want. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let them come to South Africa. Let them start manufacturing. Let them employ our local graduates, right? And like in India, these local graduates go in there and they start to learn, right? And in 5 years' time, they might go out and set up a smaller, company.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they would have global expertise.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what I think. I think Africa alone will not be able to do it. We just need to create incentives so that we attract companies to come here. That's the one thing. The other thing also is, how can we look at our strengths in Africa and use those? So the big one is obviously agriculture, right? We have land, we have sun, we generally have really good conditions. We have hardworking people, right? So, and the pharmaceutical industry is largely built on the products of agriculture. So if you think about starch, right? If you think about even things like magnesium stearate, all these kind of as we call them, ingredients, we can actually be growing these things. But what we need again is to look at how we process them. So let's focus on how do we process these things. And then you might find that some of the APIs, okay, like if you think about cannabis, in another 5 years, those cannabinoids are probably going to be the basis of even more interesting molecules. as semi-synthetic analogs of some sort or other. So this is the time where we can also be looking at cannabis. I was also looking at nicotine, right? So everybody's talking, oh, smoking, let's ban smoking. But actually, nicotine is the basis of quite a lot of pharmaceutical products, right? So if we just turn that around and said, okay, we are not really growing tobacco mainly for the smokers market, but maybe to get out compounds, phytochemical compounds that we can then semi-synthesize, I think that the conversation will change.
It will, and I mean that's a very low input cost to source that, and that's obviously if you look at Zimbabwe and you look at the focus on tobacco and other regions, Malawi, then it's one of and that's actually like you said, you're not just exporting the product to import it at much higher rate. You do the actual, and I think it's an interesting space, and it's one where phytomedicine and the semi-synthetics or cheap base inputs it is a big future driver, and I think it's important for Africa to enable technology to be doing that, because we've had fine chemicals and CPT, chemical process technologies, and then I'd say the largest, if we could define the cannabis cultivators as API manufacturers, then we've had a massive resurgence in APIs in Africa, but we've had a limited exposure. I mean, even with antiretrovirals, I mean, there's a lot there that we could produce more of these APIs in the country. So no, thank you, Prof. I appreciate your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know we're probably going to have you back on in the future, and I like the theme of African, botanicals, because cannabis is part of that definition. But I think it's important to talk about all the other things out there. Scaletium. There's moringa. There's so much more to be unpacked. Yeah. And I think the audience would have a similar affinity to understanding those spaces and understanding that route from functional foods, functional medicines, botanicals, and then obviously as it goes up the value chain, and then like you said, even counterfeiting becomes a problem at some point when you're successful. That's it, So, Prof, appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Okay.